Real quick review. Theology of the cross, just to kind of keep these ideas up here. We're going to be doing a cool thing on Maundy Thursday tomorrow because it's a kind of non-traditional Maundy Thursday and that we're not going to be able to be together to do communion. One of the things Pastor Getzinger and I decided we're going to focus on is maybe some sections from Maundy Thursday evening that we haven't maybe spent a whole lot of time studying in the past. And one of those things is in John, from John chapters 14 through 17, you have this huge, long, extended section of Jesus laying out his heart to his disciples, getting them ready for his execution and crucifixion. And all of chapter 17 is what's called the high priestly prayer. And it's this amazing, big, long, beautiful prayer that Jesus prays out loud so his disciples can hear him. And you hear him talking to the Father on behalf of his disciples and for us. And it's this gorgeous, gorgeous prayer. And so tomorrow night, Maundy Thursday, we're going to have our readings be that prayer. We're going to break it into sections and do kind of little devotionals on each section there. But this is kind of interesting, the way that Jesus starts out his high priestly prayer. This is the very first couple lines of his prayer to his Father in heaven. And he says, "Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, that your Son may glorify you." And then a couple verses later, he says, "I have brought you glory on earth by finishing the work you gave me to do." And I think this is an amazing section of scripture because it just points so heavily at this thing that we call the theology of the cross. Because here Jesus is talking about glorifying his Father, right? And he's praying that God glorifies him. And what is this moment when God is going to glorify his Son? When is he going to put his Son on his full, most glorious display? The cross, right? He says, "I brought you glory on earth by finishing the work you gave me to do." So Christ's humiliation of actually setting aside his glorious powers, we might say, and living as a human for you and me, and then dying on the cross, that's what Jesus is talking about here as his glorious work. And to the outside world, outside of the church looking in, there's nothing less glorious than what Jesus did here on earth, especially if we're thinking about the cross. But yet, Jesus says that's actually the most glorious that you will find God, the work that I did on the cross. And so at the heart of this idea of the theology of the cross is this idea of the hiddenness of God, that God's greatest glory is to be found in the cross, not in displays of humanly understood power and might. So we find God hidden and we understand God most, and we see the heart of God and comprehend God the most that we possibly can here on earth when we're looking at that cross because of what Christ is doing through that cross. And so we can contrast that theology of the cross then with this idea of the theology of glory, that according to our sinful nature, what we want is a God that is all powerful and who's zapping his enemies, and especially zapping our enemies for us and making our lives as awesome as possible. But God has decided to reveal himself in an entirely different way, and that's to reveal himself through the cross. And in fact, he tells us if we are pursuing a theology of glory, if what we're trying to do is instead find God in the glorious power and might, and especially our own glorious power and might and our own merit and good works, then we're actually pushing ourselves further away from God. And so then this naturally leads into this idea of you, the Christian, then are called to carry your cross, just like Christ did. And so we see this kind of inverted idea of what we would think God would do for us. On the one hand, we find a God that's most on display when he's suffering on a cross, and then the Christian is most on display when he or she is carrying your cross, right? So just some powerful ideas there. And that's going to shape the way that we approach this idea of ethics then. We talked about last time this idea that for Christians, both the motivation as well as the action itself makes an act moral or immoral. We are interested just as much in the motivation, the heart of an individual, as much as the actual actions that are performed. And we saw lots and lots of biblical examples of that. As kind of our big thesis statement, as we're kind of trying to understand Christian ethics, we said the Christian's goal then is to not only do the right action, but act from the right motivation. And then we added the idea that a faith which sees our actions as worthless apart from grace and is valuable to God as thanksgiving, that's kind of our goal here, right? That we want to grow in seeing our actions on our own as worthless, and the biggest value that comes from them is that they're acts of thanksgiving, not something meritorious in God's eyes. And so the goal of the Christian is the cultivation of a heart that's completely dependent on God's grace. And so we want to especially be in tune then that that's also kind of God's goal when it comes to our lives as well, that God's goal is to help cultivate in us a heart that's as dependent on him as possible. And anything that God does providentially to do that, to make us more dependent on his grace, we call good. We call that good. And that's where the Christian's definition of good is going to come in. And sometimes to the world, it doesn't look good. And there's that theology of the cross idea again, this kind of inverted idea of what we would expect. And so one of the ways that we're then going to be looking at the idea of Christian morality and Christian character development is, I think this is a very helpful way of thinking about it. On the one hand, we talked about that through the natural knowledge of God, Gentiles, non-Christians are able to have a grasp somewhat of God's law, an imperfect grasp, but a grasp nevertheless. And so this comes down in lots of different cultures and in the laws that they create and the way that they see things. And Aristotle came up with this fourfold way of thinking about virtue: justice, courage, self-control, and wisdom. And I think this is really good because in Aristotle's way of thinking about this, and this is something that Pastor Getzinger's and my professor Daniel Deutschlander points out often, is that you find in God's justice, you find in justice this mirror of God's law, and that the primary virtue of the cardinal virtues, justice, fits very well into this idea of God's law. But then, of course, there needs to be that mirror, and so Christians see ethics as very incomplete if we're only talking about those four virtues. And so based on Paul's words, Christians historically have added three more virtues: mercy, faith, and hope. And especially that mercy one, which is going to be the primary Christian virtue, that's going to especially reflect aspects of God's gospel. And so we find, on the one hand, in the cardinal virtues, we're going to see an emphasis on God's law and on God's sense of justice and being a just God. And then when it comes to the Christian virtues, we're going to see an emphasis on God being a merciful and a loving God. And that's going to be the way that we kind of move through things. And we'll take a look at justice today. We talked last time about this idea that unbelievers, through the natural knowledge of God, they know something of God's law, including a limited sense of right motivation. And so this is why you have lots of different Christian theologians throughout time, like Luther himself, saying things like Aesop's fables. This is good stuff. We can find things that are beneficial when we're looking at these things. They're not going to give us full sense of Christian ethics, not even close, but there are beneficial things that we can learn from them. Further, unbelievers can use God's law as a curb for civic righteousness, but not spiritual moral righteousness before God. And that's, so just kind of a summary of where we've been so far. And especially on this idea of God's law as a curb, there's an important distinction that we want to make. And this is where we'll kind of start. Is there's this distinction we have to make theologically between what we call moral righteousness and civic righteousness. So moral righteousness, here we're talking about that status before God. When God looks at you, what does he see and what does God demand out of humankind? So the status of just and morally perfect in the sight of the holy and morally perfect God. And we can find scripture galore pointing out that no human is morally righteous based on his or her own merit, right? There's no way, because of sin, that you can make yourself perfectly meritoriously just in God's eyes. Through faith, though, God attributes moral righteousness to sinners on behalf of Jesus' death. So think of maybe all those verses that Paul says about Abraham, and this is quoted from the book of Genesis, where Abraham believed and it was credited to him as righteousness. So he was righteous in God's eyes because God used that faith as the tool to hold on to the promises of God. Now we can compare that with what theologians call civic righteousness. And this is the idea that humans in a limited capacity are able to perform just actions in adherence to God's law. But we're talking about this in a limited capacity, especially in regards to motivation, right? They can never do this with a perfect motivation. And you and I in our sin, we can't do this with a perfect motivation either. But especially thinking about unbelievers, these actions are beneficial for society and civilization, and so they're admirable. But their goodness is ultimately apparent, we would say, and it can't provide moral righteousness before God. So maybe by way of illustration, think back to your good old school days and learning things like the history of government and stuff like that. And where did the idea of democracy come from? But it came from the Greeks, right? Imperfectly, if you look back at Athenian democracy, there's a lot that's wanting there. But at the same time, there's a lot that's beneficial. And there's a reason that we've still held on to a lot of the ideas of democracy that flowed out of Greek history. Or maybe think of the idea of a republic, right, which comes from Roman law as well. So both of these, both the idea of a Roman republic and a Greek democracy, those are both completely non-believing, unchristian ideas. Where did the beneficial aspects of that come from? The natural knowledge of God in the hearts of these pagans made them able to develop useful, beneficial ideas for society. And so that's what we mean when we talk about civic righteousness. Similarly, you can talk about having great neighbors that aren't Christians, right? So you could have a Mormon neighbor or a Muslim neighbor that might be fantastic neighbors. They have a lot of things in line as far as their actions go that just make them very good for society. But we would not say that because they're good neighbors, they're righteous before God, right? Because they're not. They're missing the wrong motivation that God is interested in. And so we're going to make this distinction then between moral righteousness and civic righteousness. Any questions
Pastor,
about this before we jump into the idea of justice?
one question, Pastor. It's Mike.
Yeah. Hey, Mike.
If Abraham believed God and did not leave the land of Ur, but totally believed God, would it have been credited to him as righteousness?
I don't know. That's speculation. What we do know is that Abraham did sin a bunch, and his faith was still credited to him as righteous. There's plenty of times that he did disobey God, and his faith was credited to him as righteous.
But my point is, it's the fact that I'm questioning what is belief, because if you believe God, wouldn't you do what he said, which is basically what Abraham did? He was told to leave the land of Ur, the land of his birth, and to go out, and God would make him into a nation. So he believed and he went.
If we're saying that faith produces fruit, you're absolutely right. So the faith of Abraham, his trusting in God's promises, produced good fruit, like leaving Ur when God asked him to do that. But we would still make a distinction between the works themselves, the fruits of faith that Scripture talks about, and the faith itself that's credited as righteous. So,
right, but the two can't be apart either. The faith would produce it no matter what.
Yes, right. That's why it's called fruits of faith, right? Is because this is something that's naturally produced by the fruit. Good. Any other questions? We're going to revisit this topic as well as we kind of move forward. All right, I want to talk about justice. So this is a painting that was originally about Socrates. You got Socrates on the right there, the famous ugliest philosopher that ever lived. And in this painting, he's actually talking to Alcibiades, who was a famous student of Socrates, who kind of went off the deep end, living a very licentious lifestyle. But we're not going to talk about Alcibiades. I really like this painting of Socrates. And you can imagine that instead of Alcibiades, who he's talking to here is a guy named Glaucon. So there's a famous book that Plato wrote called The Republic. And the subtitle for the book, The Republic, is called On Justice. And in this dialogue that Plato wrote, so it's a conversation of people about philosophical ideas. In this dialogue that Plato wrote, he explores this idea of what justice is. And after some really interesting dialogue that's taking place. There's this guy named Glaucon who is on Socrates' side, but he's talking from the position of a devil's advocate here. And he's trying to get Socrates to really kind of pinpoint exactly what he means when he's talking about this idea of justice. And so this is Glaucon talking to Socrates, and Glaucon says, "Tell me, Socrates, do you think there is a sort of good we welcome, not because we desire its consequences, but because we welcome it for its own sake? Enjoying, for example, and all the harmless pleasures from which nothing results afterward beyond enjoying having them." So he's saying, are there some goods in this world, good things, good ideas that we desire because it's good in and of itself, not because it produces good effects? And Socrates says, certainly, I think there is such a thing. Glaucon goes, all right, is there a sort of good we love for its own sake and also for the sake of its consequences? Knowing, for example, and seeing and being healthy. For we welcome such things, I imagine, on both accounts. So, for example, we like being healthy. This is a good. That's good in and of itself, being healthy. But there's also good consequences that follow from it. It's nice to be healthy because then you can go out and do other things. So is there this category of things that are good in and of themselves, and they also produce good consequences? And Socrates says, yes, there is that category as well. Glaucon goes on. And you also recognize a third kind of good, such as physical training, medical treatment when sick, medicine itself, or ways of making money generally. We would say that these are a burdensome but beneficial to us, and we would not choose them for their own sake, but for the sake of their rewards and other consequences. So Glaucon's saying, now, is there this other category of goods that we don't like doing them? They're not good in and of themselves, but they produce good consequences. So for example, physical training, right? Weightlifting is painful and hard, and why would you want to do something that's painful and hard if it wasn't for the fact that it's going to produce a good consequence? Socrates says, yes, certainly there is also this third kind, but what of it? Now here's the big question. Glaucon says, in which of them do you place justice? So is justice a good in and of itself? Or is it something that's good in and of itself and it produces good consequences? Or is it something that's not good in and of itself, but you do it anyways because it produces good consequences? Which one of these is justice out of these three options? Socrates says, I myself put it in the finest category, the one that anyone who is going to be blessed with happiness must love both because of itself and because of its consequences. So justice is good in and of itself, and it produces good consequences. Glaucon says, that is not what the masses think. On the contrary, they think it is of the burdensome kind, the one that must be practiced for the sake of the rewards and the popularity that are the consequences of a good reputation, but that is to be avoided as intrinsically burdensome. So he's saying that the masses do not agree, the common people do not agree with the idea that justice is a good in and of itself. And so here's our three options here, right? So Socrates and Glaucon are trying to understand what justice is, and they note that people view justice in three different ways. One, it could be a good for its own sake. Two, it's a good for its own sake and beneficial. Or three, it's a burden to do, but beneficial. And Socrates says it's number two. Glaucon says most people think it's number three. Which one is the right view of justice? And this is a very interesting question. And to explore this question, Glaucon tells a story to try to especially emphasize this idea that justice, and he's being a devil's advocate here, that justice is something that's burdensome to do, but people only do it because it brings about beneficial consequences. And so this is what he does. Oh, that text was not supposed to pop up. If you look in the lower left-hand corner there, you see there's this guy that's bending down against a horse there. That guy is Gyges. And what Gyges is he's the shepherd. This is a parable that Glaucon's telling. There was this guy named Gyges who he's out shepherding his sheep one day, and there's an earthquake. And Gyges is exploring after the earthquake, and he finds this big giant fissure, big crack that's in the ground. And he goes down into the crack and is exploring what's been revealed by the earthquake. And inside that big giant crack, there's this horse. And this horse that's deep down inside there, this kind of big horse, it's hollow on the inside. And he opens up the horse, and inside he finds a bunch of jewels and things like that. But then he also finds this ring. And so Gyges takes out this cool looking ring, and he doesn't think much of it, but then he goes home. And while he's hanging out with people, he's kind of playing around with the ring. He's got it on his finger, and he notices then that if he turns it one way, all of a sudden he's invisible. And everyone's wondering where Gyges went. But then when he turned the ring back the other way, he would reappear. So Gyges has found this ring that makes him invisible, that if you turn it, it makes you invisible, and then it can make you reappear. Now imagine that you found that ring. What would you do with that ring? If you all of a sudden discovered a ring that gave you the ability to make yourself invisible, what would you do with that ring? And I'll just pose that out there to y'all right now. What would you do with that ring? Or maybe I'll ask it this way. What was the first thought that popped into your head about what you would do with that ring? Was the first thought, if anyone would be so bold as to share with me. You get that ring. I don't
mind speaking up, Pastor. This is Evelyn.
Yeah.
I'm seriously nosy, and I know this. So my first quick flesh instinct is, hey, I want to go listen to somebody's conversation that I normally wouldn't be privy to. And that sounds awful, but it's true. Like, that's the first thing I think, I want to be able to hear something that I probably wouldn't hear if people thought I was standing.
Oh, yeah. That's great. Just think of all the juicy tidbits you'd be able to find with this ring. You'd be able to know exactly what people think about you, right? You'd be able to figure this out, right? And that person that you know has been talking behind your back, you'd be able to maybe put a recorder in your pocket, right? And follow the person and do this or that, right? Or you could, all the juiciest bits of gossip right there at your fingertips. Yeah, that's awesome. You know what Gyges did when he got that ring? He used it to kill the king and take over the empire. And there's a lot of other nasty stuff that went along with it. So in other words, Gyges used that ring to fulfill his greatest, deepest, unjust desires, right? Now, I would bet that there's very few of us that the very first thought that went into our minds when we thought about getting this ring was, man, I would be able to use this ring to set a lot of wrongs right. Because I'm having trouble even imagining how having this ring of invisibility would be able to make me right wrongs and things like that. Maybe you could come up with that. But for most of us, usually we've got a very different type of a first thought that goes into our minds.
Yeah. My very first thought was that power is way beyond what my humanity could bear well.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's a very good kind of vibe, right? If you've got an alarm that's going off kind of immediately saying, man, like it would be trouble if I had a ring like this, then I think you're onto something. Yeah. And the reason that Glaucon tells this tale is because the question is, if you got this ring, would you do what's just or would you do what's unjust? If you would find yourself doing what's unjust, then that tells you that doing the just thing isn't good in and of itself, or at least you don't believe it is, right? Because if it was a good in and of itself, you would continue to do the just thing, even if you had a ring. But the very fact that you'd be able to get away with injustice and you would spend your time doing injustice shows that justice isn't a good in and of itself. At least that's the argument that Glaucon is setting up. And it's a very strong argument. Again, Glaucon believes that justice is a good in and of itself, but he's trying to give Socrates the strongest argument to put himself against, to try to come up with why justice is a good in and of itself.
It's Mike, Pastor.
Yeah. Mike.
Would Aristotle not have argued back that that wouldn't be virtuous, because virtuous would be to do the right thing, regardless of, again, for the sake of doing right, for doing good for the sake of doing the good. So they would recognize that using it to fulfill some evil desire is not virtuous. That's vicious.
Right.
Incontinent, or whatever, but that'd probably be more in the vicious category.
Yep.
So even though they were not of the perspective that we have, because it's hard for us to check our bias at the door and pretend like we don't know that someone's watching, or that someone has laid down a law for us to follow of what is right and what is wrong.
Yep.
Coming at it even from their perspective, people do have a sense of right and wrong, even if it's misplaced.
Yeah.
That's why the whole point is it's invisible, so nobody will know I did it. So he knows in the saying of that it is wrong, but if no one catches me, is it wrong?
Yeah.
And that's why Aristotle argued things that would be unvirtuous, that would be vicious, that would be doing something wrong because you think you can get away with it.
Yeah, not just Aristotle, but of course the rest of Plato's Republic. So this is just book 2 in the Republic, and the rest of the Republic is meant to be an illustration of how justice is a good in and of itself. And Aristotle is going to pick up that same project, and so will another 2,000 years of philosophy, right? Trying to demonstrate very clearly. But the question still remains, is it a good in and of itself to do something virtuous? Or do we just do what's virtuous because it's going to somehow produce the right consequences? But if we took away those consequences, would we still do the virtuous thing? And that's an interesting question. And here's what we can learn kind of definitively from the Ring of Gyges. And this is a huge, wonderful philosophical topic, but just so that we don't spend the whole time talking about the Ring of Gyges here, I think there's some very interesting theological truths we can get out of this. One is that the Ring of Gyges demonstrates that the sinful nature desires to do what is unjust. So regardless of whether or not justice is something good in and of itself, which it is, we'll get to that, what the Ring of Gyges demonstrates is that we want to do what's unjust, and we are sorely tempted when there's no consequences to do the unjust thing. So I think that's huge, right? Second thing is whether there are eternal consequences is of the utmost importance. So the whole point of the Ring of Gyges is you could get away with it all, right? Now, if there are final consequences, even if you can get away with things for the short time, but at some later point, there is going to be a final reckoning, then that changes the situation. And so Plato himself is later going to admit that there are always consequences because there are gods. And he's going to define gods specifically in the idea that they are perfectly good and virtuous, that they're not the type of typical Greek gods that are immoral, but that there are good gods that will always make sure that justice pays and that injustice always suffers consequences. And then thirdly, regardless of how people would act, if they had the Ring of Gyges, we still intuitively, through our conscience that God has put there, know that it is always good to do the right thing, even if the consequences aren't evidentially beneficial, right? We still know on an intuitive level. And that's one of the things that Mike was getting at. And so Aristotle and these other philosophers, they're going to work hard at trying to provide a foundation for this intuitive thought that we all have. That even though we know we could get away with things, our conscience is still going to create guilt there, at least for a while, right? Until we tear down that conscience. And so
I have one more thought to that, Pastor.
One more.
So from the book of Judges, the parable of the trees that bear fruit that refuse the kingship, and finally the thorn bush accepts the king. And if the thorn bush isn't embraced by the other trees, then a firewall will come out from the thorn bush. There's a bit of a anybody that thinks that I'm just going to do this one simple thing and then I'll stop is kidding themselves.
Yeah.
So they've already demonstrated that there's something in there that they will continue to use it again and again, and it'll go further and further. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. So I would also argue that it's not just about getting caught. It's about something in you that will keep going further and further and further. That's the thorn bush rather than a tree that produces fruit that serves others. The thorn bush is all about serving himself, I guess. And that power will eventually lead to destruction.
Yeah, and we are going to be talking not so much in our justice section here, but on some of the other virtues about this idea that the Bible teaches this, and the pagans did have a good vibe on the idea that virtue is habitual, but so is vice, right? And injustice. That when we fall into bad patterns, this can lead into downward spirals. You typically don't just do one sin once. Yeah, good. All right, so that kind of as an introduction to this idea of justice.
Yeah, Pastor.
It's kind of interesting. Yep.
This is nothing more than the recreation of the story of the Garden of Eden, where man had to make a choice.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we choose wrong.
Yeah. Philosophy's dirty secret is virtually everything is just a retelling of the Garden of Eden and a few other, important biblical stories. But yeah, right. Yeah, there's really strong ties to the Garden of Eden there. And a lot of people think this is where Tolkien got his ring from, but I would argue against that. Deuteronomy 32. So this is the very beginning of the Song of Moses, one of the most beautiful songs that we find in the Torah, a big long one that Moses sings. And it begins with these words. Moses sings, "I will proclaim the name of the Lord. Oh, praise the greatness of our God. He is the rock. His works are perfect, and all his ways are just. A faithful God who does no wrong, upright and just is he." If there is one theme here that Moses is playing repeatedly, what's that theme? If not justice, right? The idea of his works being perfect, his ways just. He's faithful in the sense that he does not do what's wrong. He's upright and he's just, right? He's just finding as many ways possible to talk about this idea of God being a just God. So in the Song of Moses, God basically says that his name is justice. That's one way that we can see the very first couple verses here. Now, it doesn't end there. It's a much larger song, and we see especially a lot in other places in the Torah that his name is going to be much more than just justice, right? And he's going to get into his mercy in very deep ways. But that's not to say that we don't have this solid theme of God being a just God. What does that tell us about the relationship between God and the idea of justice? What then is justice? So what do you think is the relationship between God and the idea of justice? And I'll let you kind of riff on this at least for 60 seconds here. Any thoughts?
Pastor, this is Evelyn.
Yeah. Evelyn.
There are times where, I guess, a mantra around our house that we use often is, we'll ask our kids, would you like mercy or would you like justice? And we put those two as separate. The idea being, okay, if we do what is just, then you get what you deserve. But if you are given mercy, you are given pardon that you don't deserve.
Yeah.
And inevitably, we have tried very hard to teach them that they always want to choose mercy, always. But it's such an inclination of the flesh to choose justice for your neighbor.
Yeah.
Because you want to be vindicated, right? You want to have them feel the pain, but then when it's you, you want the mercy. And so I think that's one of the ways that our family would choose to define justice. I don't think you brought up the mercy aspect here, but I would wonder if that's not a contrast.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So again, this is going to be a major theme in the Torah when God is described and when he lays out his name, right? There's very famous sections where God says what his name is, like when he hides Moses in the cleft of the rock, and then he goes past Moses and he says his name, it says, and that name is like, paragraphs long. And what we usually have in that is we have two aspects of God that are on display. One is him being a righteous God and a just God. And then the other aspect is him being a merciful God, right? So we see him punishing people and sons to the third and fourth generation, but having mercy on thousands of generations, right? Things like that. So both aspects are reflected. And what's kind of interesting, the way that you ask your kids the question, which would you rather have, justice or mercy? Why are they both legitimate options? Because they both are major characteristics of God, right? You're offering them one aspect of God. And this is what's kind of interesting. So on the one hand, we know that God is love, right? We know this very well, that the idea of love is wrapped up into the identity of God. You cannot separate love from God. The two of them are behind. God is love, right? In the exact same way, we would say God is justice, that this is an indivisible characteristic from him, that he's completely united with the idea. And if we want to know what justice is, in the same way, if we were to say, what is love? You look at Christ. If we wanted to ask, what is justice? We could look at justice, right? There are two sides of the same coin of who God is. Two very different concepts, right, in the way that the Bible speaks about them, but the two of them are absolutely united and indivisible in the concept of God. Good. And so there's a few things which are kind of interesting with this, is if we look especially at the idea, then on the one hand, you've got natural theology teaching us that God is just. So this is something that the pagans, again, share. God has embodied his nature of justice in his law. And so God's justice corresponds with the doctrine of God's law. And in other words, right, when we ask, what does the conscience tell us about God? What we respond is that it tells us that God is a just God, desiring that we act just, right? It tells us the kind of requirements that God has as a just God. The other kind of interesting thing about the virtue of justice is the only cardinal virtue that is a good in and of itself. So here we come to that in and of itself idea. The other virtues are good only insofar as they are in the service of just ends. And maybe by way of an illustration is, so if you're thinking about the other cardinal virtues, courage, for example, can you talk about a courageous Nazi? Yeah, I mean, theoretically, you can talk about a courageous Nazi, but is a courageous Nazi good? So if you are just, then you are good, but you can be courageous, but for the wrong reasons, and in so being, you're not good. Right? Or so, for example, there's a maxim among drug dealers, right? I just had it beforehand. About using your own drugs. You know what I'm talking about? Anyone know this? Like, don't get high on your supply, right? There it is. Don't get high on your supply. So there's a good maxim of self-control, right? You want to have self-control and not take the drugs that you're dealing. That would be a good kind of example of prudence and self-control. But does that make you a good person if you've got good self-control as a drug dealer? Obviously not, right? Justice is the only thing where we would say out of the cardinal virtues that if you are just, then you are good. Whereas you can be courageous and not good. You can have self-control but not be good. You can be wise, but you could be a very wise tyrant or evil tyrant, right, of some sort. So that's a second really interesting thing about justice. It's a good in and of itself. And as such, it shows us how it's so intimately connected with the nature of God. And then the third thing is justice overrides all other considerations. There is no price high enough to do something unjust. No matter how much good for how many people is done, it would still be wrong to seek restitution for an unwilling, innocent person. Does that make sense? So no matter how much good you could argue that you could produce by doing something that's unjust, the whole nature of the idea of injustice is that it would still be wrong that this would still be wrong to do the unjust thing. And so this also sometimes is talked about at the heart of the gospel. So on the one hand, why did Jesus need to die on the cross? Why couldn't God just forgive us of all of our sins? Any thoughts on that? Why was it necessary that Jesus die in order for our sins to be forgiven? What does justice have to do with this?
Because he had to fulfill the law. So, like earlier with Evelyn, that God does not decide justice for grace. Both had to be fulfilled. So that's why Jesus had to die on the cross to pay the price for our sins as a substitute for us having to pay.
Yeah.
So one way or another, that law still was fulfilled. Justice was still upheld. but we were also given grace. That's why I say God is both. There is no forgiveness without the shedding of blood.
Yep. Yeah, right. So
One thing in light of the conversation that we have with our kids, we've also talked about the concept of forgiveness.
yeah,
And any cases when you are choosing to forgive someone, you choose to accept that you are going to feel some type of pain and not retaliate to the person that caused that pain, right?
Yeah.
That's part of what we are trying to teach them to be that concept. And again, it's very philosophical and all of that, but we have multiple chances every day, both from me and them, to practice this.
Yeah.
So one of the things I think is important that keys into what you're saying is when you do build, and it has to have we look to Christ as the one who has taken that burden and the pain from us. He has removed us. He has taken the wrath that God's justness does deserve and given us mercy. And so we also act as parents in forgiving our children of the sin that they have against us, assuming in us that the pain we feel when we watch them sin, or the pain the other person experienced because of that person's sin, some of that has to be absorbed, and that uncomfortable feeling is something that we try to make them grapple with. And maybe this sounds too poetic and whatever, but I'm okay with trying to show that, at some point, it doesn't just fall to the wayside and nobody feels it.
I think that hits the nail right on the head, right? So, and this is how the concept of forgiveness includes both the ideas of justice and righteousness, or justice and mercy, right? Because if you are forgiving someone, what's the difference between saying, I forgive you, and saying, it's all right, or it's okay? If you're saying it's okay, right? If someone says, I'm sorry, and you say, it's okay, what you're saying is that they didn't actually do something wrong, right? It's okay what you did. You didn't do something wrong. If you say, I forgive you, what are you saying? You're saying, yes, you did do something wrong. Somehow you broke God's law. You acted unjustly, but I am going to forgive you. And in the realms of parenting, especially, a good parent will forgive their children, but there will still be consequences, right? So just because you forgive someone doesn't mean that there aren't any consequences, right? So if your son, for example, let me come up with an example here, right? So your son, you tell your son to mow the lawn, and your son doesn't do it. And so later on, you address your son from not mowing the lawn. And the son says, I'm sorry for not mowing the lawn. And you say, I forgive you. Do you just leave it at that? You can still forgive them and say, I forgive you, now mow the lawn, right? So just because sins are forgiven doesn't mean that there isn't an actual weight to it. In fact, it's the exact opposite. And so this is a very interesting thing if you ever pay much attention to, especially maybe looking at Muslim Christian apologists debating with Muslims and things like that. A lot of times what's at the heart of debates between Christian apologists and Muslim apologists is this idea of justice, where the Christian is able to say, God is completely just in that he took out the full penalty of sin on Christ, but our sins are forgiven. So God is able to have mercy on us and still uphold his justice. Whereas in the Muslim worldview, there is no actual atonement for sin. And so even though God calls himself just and merciful, there's a disconnect there. And so a good Christian apologist a lot of times is harpooning right for this idea that the Muslim God cannot be a just God and forgive sins at the same time. So good. All right, we're going to move on because there's a lot of really cool stuff here. All right, so this is a guy named John Rawls. He's considered one of the top political philosophers of the 20th century. He wrote a very famous book called A Theory of Justice. And in that book, A Theory of Justice, it's probably the most famous work of political philosophy in the second half of the 20th century by a philosopher. And in it, he comes up with this idea called the veil of ignorance. And in it, he says, among the essential features of this situation, this veil of ignorance that he's put forward. So the idea is, can you come up with a way that you can come up with just laws? How could you operate in such a way that you could come up with what the best just laws would be in a country, let's say. And he says, this is how you could do it. So what you would do is you would put yourself in a situation where no one knows his place in society, his class position or social status, nor does anyone know his fortune in the distribution of natural assets and abilities, his intelligence, strength, and the like. I shall even assume that the parties do not know their conceptions of the good or their special psychological propensities. The principles of justice are chosen behind a veil of ignorance. So what he's saying is this: if you want to come up with the most just laws possible, what you want to do is you want to take a bunch of people, put them in a room together, and all of these people, they need to operate from behind a veil of ignorance where you don't know what when you go back into society, you don't know what your place in society is going to be. You don't know your class position, your social status. You don't know maybe what gender or what race you are, or you don't know what your intelligence level is, what your strengths are. You don't know any of these things. You don't know anything at all about what kind of person you're going to be in society. And so if you could get a bunch of people in a room, and all these people in the room could not know what position they're going to have when they go into society, what laws would they come up with? Well, the idea is that they would come up with the laws that are the most impartial, right? Because you're not taking your own position into consideration when you're coming up with these laws. So this was his idea of how you would kind of go about creating just laws for a society. And it's a very interesting idea. And there's a lot of discussion about whether or not this actually could produce just laws and things like that. But what Rawls' veil of ignorance experiment does demonstrate most maybe isn't so much how to discover what is just, although maybe it could, that's arguable. But what it's really interesting about it is that it shows that we're by nature unjust, right? Because we can only talk about what would be just if we imagined we were not ourselves. And so this is kind of one of the interesting reflections that you might have on it. Yeah, that would maybe be a good way to talk about what just laws are, but why do we have to do that? Why would we have to pretend that we don't know who we're going to be in order to come up with just laws? And that's because deep down, we are very unjust people. It is ridiculously hard to come up with laws that are impartial, where we're not considering what kind of benefit it would have for you in your situation, right, when you bring it up. And so on the topic of deciding what is just, we can make a couple observations here. So on the one hand, the idea that some things are right and some wrong, they presuppose a standard to judge things right and wrong, and so presuppose laws, that is, statements regarding what you should or shouldn't do. So if you're even going to have a discussion about whether or not some things are right or some things are wrong, some laws, then there's some type of standard that you're talking about, and that presupposes some type of transcendent law, right? Something that transcends whatever laws it is that you're talking about, that you're balancing. In order to say that one government's laws are just and another are unjust is to invoke an overarching objective justice. And this is what philosophers call, interestingly, natural justice. Theologians call this natural law because it's based on natural knowledge of God and conscience, right? But the idea that there is this kind of objective justice that we can talk about or that we can invoke in order to say that country's laws are unjust. The only way you can say that that country's laws are unjust is if there's some other standard other than that country's laws or laws in general that you're invoking, right? There's got to be something that you're talking about. But as Christians, what we know is that the only sure guide of what is just is God's revealed law, and its application will be imperfect since it's sinful humans applying it. And this is kind of the big kind of reality check for us. And I think Rawls' veil of ignorance points this out very nicely, is that we're going to be imperfect when it comes to trying to create just laws in our society, or for that matter, in our household as parents, right? Or in other relationships with people. But this does not stop God's law from functioning as a curb, from being something that's generally beneficial for us. And I want to just get a couple more ideas out there. Oh yeah, and this is kind of maybe the big last philosophical point we can make here. Reducing justice to a typical political position is dangerous for the Christian. All right? So to reduce justice to either a concept like equality or democracy, it's going to create enormous problems. On the one hand, is it just for everyone to be treated equally when everyone is clearly not identical, especially in merit, right? So for example, a teacher handing out the same grades to every student. On the other hand, the majority opinion can clearly be unjust at times. So this doesn't mean that you can't think politically as a Christian, but I would say, and I don't want to have a whole lot of discussion on this right now, we'll have plenty of time for this later, but I would like to say that it is very dangerous to try to take God's justice and to reduce it down to a political position or political idea like equality. Now with that, I want to, since we've got a few minutes left here, I want to especially kind of get into this idea of justice under the cross. So there's this guy named Peter who's very interesting in the Bible. And there's this very cool section where there's this kind of special thing happening between Jesus and Peter in the book of Matthew. And one time, Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And his disciples say to him, well, some of them say that you're Elijah, and some of them say that you're this person and that person. And then he asks his disciples, well, who do you say that I am? And Peter says to Jesus, he says, you're the Messiah. Right? You're the Messiah. And Jesus' answer to this, then, his response to Peter is, he says, you've got it, right? Blessed are you, Peter. In fact, your name is going to be Rock, and on this, I'm going to build my church, right? And the gates of Hades are not going to overcome it. And so he says this to Peter, but he's talking especially about the idea of Peter's confession that Jesus is the Messiah, that on this confession, he's going to build his church. But because this is Jesus saying this to Peter, saying that there's going to be this church that's built and there's going to be gates that Hades are not going to overcome, we have over time kind of created this idea of Peter being the gatekeeper of heaven. You know what I'm talking about when we're telling jokes, right? Who is it that when you die and you get up to the pearly gates, who's always the gatekeeper? It's Peter. In fact, if you look at this Rembrandt picture here, whenever you see a classical painting of Peter, what usually does Peter have? He's got some keys. Do you see them there by his feet there? That's because Peter was in this dialogue with Jesus, where Jesus says, the gates of Hades are not going to overcome this confession of yours. So that's this beautiful section of scripture, this beautiful discussion that goes on. But what happens right after this is just absolutely amazing. So the very next verse after that section is this part right here. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. Peter took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him. Never, Lord, he said, this shall never happen to you. Jesus turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. Then Jesus said to his disciples, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. And so here we've got this famous take up your cross and follow me section from Jesus. But what's interesting is that contextually, we have just had Jesus say to Peter, you're a rock, right before this, right? And the gates of Hades aren't going to overcome this confession of yours. And then in the very next breath, as far as the account goes, Jesus is saying to Peter, get behind me, Satan. So all of a sudden, we've got this very clear contrast to what Jesus is saying to Peter. Why? Because again, it's what Peter is saying here. Peter has just finished calling Jesus the Messiah. And now what is Peter doing? but he is now becoming a stumbling block to people understanding that Jesus is the Messiah. In fact, he says, "You are a stumbling block to me." Peter is becoming a stumbling block to the Messiah. Why? Because he doesn't want the Messiah to die on a cross. He doesn't want the Messiah to experience injustice. So that takes place in the book of Matthew. And Peter goes through a lot over the next few decades. He sees this Messiah. Well, he doesn't see him crucified. We don't know if he's there. But he has the experience of his Messiah crucified. Then he sees the Messiah raised. And then he goes on and becomes a leader in the church. And he writes this letter called 1 Peter, which is a very interesting letter because it's called the letter of suffering. At least that's one of the ways that we describe it. Because the main theme of 1 Peter is that Peter is trying to encourage his Christians, to encourage Christians in the early Christian church to embrace suffering as something that God works through to his glory. And so this is what Peter says at one point. He says, "It's commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because they are conscious of God. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God." So what's Peter saying there? How would you put that in your own words? Especially in this whole context of justice that we've been talking about and injustice. How ought the Christian to operate in this world of justice and injustice? And what does this have to do with carrying our crosses? Hey, Mika, how you doing?
Hi, Pastor.
Yeah.
Well, for me, it's, we're going to suffer persecution in this world. And although it's not just, we are to endure it. And there's a lot of enduring things that are undeserved than just being, going to jail because I stole something.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. We should be okay on some level with injustice, right? Yeah. Why? Why should a Christian be okay with it?
Because Jesus did it. Christ did it. And we are to live in his example.
And what servant is above his master, right? Yeah, spot on. So with that, we can maybe have one principle here for Christians trying to strive to embrace justice under the cross. So the Christian is willing to undergo, we would say, injustice in this world, just as Christ did, knowing justice will ultimately reign someday. And so this is kind of the big thing here, right? Is that Peter, earlier on in Matthew, he wasn't willing to see his Messiah undergo injustice. But why did Jesus have to go through, quote unquote, injustice? Why did he have to go through this trial where he was going to be accused falsely and accused of committing crimes that he didn't commit and get executed on the cross? Ultimately, so that God's will could be done, right? His ultimate will could be done. And so Christians were willing to undergo injustice just like our God did for us, so that God's will can ultimately reign at the end. Good. What time we got? All right, I'll try to wrap this up. So here we've got Paul speaking in 2 Corinthians. That's a picture of Paul there preaching in front of a bunch of people in a synagogue, I think, because they got their heads covered there. And this is one of the things that Paul wrote. So if you know anything about Paul's missionary work, God used him to do amazingly cool things. He sowed the seeds of the church in the Gentile world, basically, right? Started dozens of missions and other things like that. Now, that seems all glorious and cool, but what was the life of Christ, or what was the life of Paul like? It was very difficult. We're talking about a guy that was beaten several times, left for dead, stoned, hated by his own people. Just a very, very painful life in a lot of different ways. And there's this one episode in his life where Paul says these words. He says, at the end of 2 Corinthians, he says, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. Who's given it to him? God, right? God gave him this thorn in his flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So he talks about this thorn. What's the thorn? No one has any idea. We got no idea. If anyone tells you they know what this thorn is, they're lying. There's a lot of good ideas out there, but there's a lot of ideas. We don't have any clear indications from Scripture what this thorn is that Paul was dealing with. It could have been a physical illness. It could have been people in his lives. It could have been some form of persecution that he was dealing with. Who knows what this thorn was? But what we do know when we're looking at the types of things that Paul struggled with in his life, there were not only, maybe there were physical things, but there were definitely a lot of hardships from people. He was treated horribly by his Jewish community, and he's going to ultimately be executed in Rome, right? And yet, how does Paul talk about dealing with hardships and insults and persecutions and difficulties? How does he respond to this? Anyone? How does he feel about it? Put in your own words. Or maybe let's put it this way. Why does he delight in them? Because that's what he says. I delight in all of these things. Why does he delight in them?
Pastor,
Yeah.
Heather, I think because he trusted God and knew that what God decided was right for him.
Yeah, and that's the big thing, right? Is that somehow he had a view. Sometimes we talk about this idea of a meta-narrative, a higher overarching story that made sense of what he was going through. So obviously there isn't anything good about being insulted or going through hardships or persecutions in and of themselves, right? Those are bad things. Those are the effects of a sinful world. But the larger context that Paul was able to see these things in, God promised that this was good for him, right? That he was working through this for Paul's glory. And so he ends with these words, when I am weak, then I am strong. Because where is he putting all of his reliance and where is he putting all of his what is he relying on in order, what's he relying on in life? Is he relying on the actual events around him? No, instead he's forced to rely on Christ and to rely on God as the person that's going to bring him through these things. And again, this, we're saying this very, very truncated and very short sections here. It's one thing to just kind of read Scripture and talk about it. It's another thing to be in the midst of these things. If we were counseling together in my office, I probably would not pull this up when you were going through hardships. We'd be talking about other things. But this is ultimately the truth about the hardships and persecutions that we face in this world, including the injustice that we experience, that God uses it for our good, for our character, and for our reliance on him, to grow our faith and our dependence on him. And that's what he means when he says that I'm weak, is that he is forced through his weaknesses to cast himself entirely on Christ, who is really the only strong and immovable thing out there. So maybe we could put it like this. Christians know that God will use the injustice of this world for the sake of building a Christian's character and faith. Again, much easier said than experiencing this, but this is the promise that God gives us as we're facing the injustices of this world, is that God will use this to make us depend on him and to put all of our marbles on Christ, which is exactly where we need to be. Two more passages. Romans 12:19. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, it's mine to avenge. I will repay, says the Lord, right? So one of the ideas of Christians cultivating a sense of justice is not to be cultivating a sense of revenge, right? But instead it's to cultivate a sense of leaving justice where it belongs, right? Being okay with letting God be the ultimate judge of things and the ultimate person to carry out sentences. Isaiah, learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. So on the one hand, Paul in Romans tells us leave justice in God's hands in a certain sense, or at least revenge, right? But here in Isaiah, we have the clear teaching that Christians are supposed to pursue justice, right? That we have a role in this world as being people that stand up for those that are facing injustice. And so how do we meld these two ideas together? Maybe we would say something like this. The Christian will stand up to injustice and work patiently and peacefully towards justice, acting respectfully towards governments as God's agents, knowing that no one can be perfectly just, right? Because the real issue in that Romans passage is the desire to take revenge, where you think that you somehow have the right to exact revenge, and that you have the right to kind of put yourself up in this transcendent seat of the judge. Whereas the goal as a Christian is instead to see the injustice around you as an agent of injustice yourself because of your own sins. And because of that, you know that you, just like everyone else around you, can't act perfectly just in this world. So you're going to still stand up for those that are experiencing injustice, and you're going to fight for them, but you're going to do it patiently and peacefully, knowing that you're just as much of a sinner in this world as the people that you are maybe standing up against that are enacting injustice. Does that make some sense? Yeah.
Yeah, Pastor, it's Mika.
Yeah, Mika.
I just wanted to add, it's also what I take away from passages like this is also in the situations where God tells us that you can only convict on the testimony of 2 witnesses or more.
Yeah.
You know, we have to, there will be times in our lives where we will be wronged in a legal manner, where we will not be able to get justice in this world.
Yep.
We need to trust that justice will come from God in those situations.
Yep. Absolutely. Yep. Yeah, we're going to find those situations for sure. Yep. The other kind of big, what? Go ahead.
It's Francis.
Yeah, Fran.
Just, would you hazard a definition at the end of this, either of just as an adjective or justice as a noun?
A definition of it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, let's talk about that right now. So I had the one slide where I said, so first of all, what is justice? We're talking about the idea of that aspect of God's just nature, right? So the law aspect of God. And I talked at one point, I had a bullet where I said, the only sure guide of what is just is God's revealed law, and its application will be imperfect since it's sinful humans applying it, but this doesn't stop God's law from functioning as a curb, right? So if we're looking for examples of justice or how to be just, we're going to be looking at God's law ultimately as a guide for justice, right? But when we're talking about justice, we're talking about that aspect of God that has to do with law, right? And with his, and the embodiment of that. We want to be careful about saying that like a definition of justice is something like fairness or equality or something like that, because the moment we do that, then we're reducing the parameters down from what the Bible talks about. Because the reality is that there isn't like a definition of justice in the Bible. Instead, we're presented with a God who is just, and he then gives us just laws. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
All right. So another big thing when we compare the Romans 12 passage and the Isaiah passage. So in the Romans passage, where is the focus? Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. Where's the focus? Is that revenge is someone has done injustice to you, and so you want to somehow claim justice, right? You want to somehow have amends made for that injustice towards you. The Isaiah passage, where is the focus? Is it on injustice being done to you? No, Isaiah here is talking about focusing on the injustice that's done to other people. And so this is kind of an important principle as well. The Christian, motivated by gospel love and Christ's selflessness, is more concerned with others receiving justice than oneself receiving justice. Does that make sense? So when it comes to the injustice that's being done to me, the Christian, or that's being done to you personally, the Christian is going to be especially trying to lean towards this Roman 12 principle of justice is in the hands of God. I am sure of his providence over all things. I know that his justice will reign at the end of all things, and he is working this through for my eternal good, right? And so we're going to have a little bit more of a comfortability with injustice that's done to us. But because of gospel love and gospel motivation, we're going to be very concerned about other people and about our neighbors that God calls us into the lives of to help. Does that make sense? So again, this kind of gets back to that idea of Christian ethics and the idea of Christian virtue, where the goal is to kind of stop thinking about ourselves and especially be thinking outwardly towards serving God and serving our neighbors.
Pastor?
Yeah.
It's Christine. I just have a quick question
Yeah.
about the focus not being on ourselves. In the Romans 12 passage, I think about egregious things that can occur to a person and how the focus isn't on us because God is avenging it. So how God's sense of justice still allows for us to recognize the injustice that's done for us, but
Right.
to not focus on it as our need to revenge, but the fact that God will avenge.
Yeah.
Like, I think there's, right, maybe I'm not
Yeah, okay. So, maybe, is this what you're thinking? You want to make sure that I'm not saying that we ignore injustice that's done to ourselves.
Right.
Egregious injustice, right? Yeah, so that's a huge point.
And I'm like, God will avenge.
Right? No, so a good example of this, Matthew 18, how does Jesus instruct us to deal with sin? Does he tell, for example, people that are being sinned against to just be silent and to just take it on the chin? Now there's aspects of turning the other cheek and things like that, but what does Jesus specifically tell us in Matthew 18 when it comes to us being sinned against? He says, address the person, the brother that's sinning against you, right? And call out that sin. And if that person doesn't listen to you, do you just let it end there? No, you go out and you go find a second person. And if the person that's sinned against you doesn't listen to those two, you go out and you get more until finally, this gets bigger, right? And but you're going to start out small to protect the person's reputation, but you're not going to let sin off the hook, so to speak, in that situation. Yeah. So we're going to temper these things, right? There's no question about that. I'm in no way suggesting that you should, let's say that you are a recipient of abuse or something like that, that the Bible just says you just need to sit there and be quiet, right? No, this Romans 12 passage here is speaking to the spirit that you have, right? That your goal isn't going to be to avenge and to punish the person that has sinned against you, but instead you're going to let God's law be the arbiter of this, and you're going to let him work this out in his providence, and this is your opportunity to be weak and let God be strong. At the same time, Christ tells us, if you've been sinned against, and this would go along with something like being the recipient of abuse, you address that person and you get to the heart of that, right? And you don't stop until that sin is taken care of, right? So yeah, good. I'm just gonna end with one thought here. This is the last slide, I promise. Justice and justification. So again, if we're getting to this idea, if you see the word justice, you have to think justification, which is, Paul's favorite concept here in the New Testament. So Paul says in 1 Corinthians, we've looked at this passage once before, I care very little if I am judged by you or by any human court. Indeed, I do not even judge myself. My conscience is clear, but that does not make me innocent. It is the Lord who judges me. And so when it comes to justice, whose verdict are we most interested in? We are most interested in the Lord's verdict and how we look to him, right? Ultimately, at the end of the day, that's the biggest courtroom that matters, and everything else ultimately, eternally doesn't matter. And that's what Paul's saying here. And so we want to tie this idea of justice with justification real quickly right at the end here. So the idea of being just for the Christian is being found righteous before God. That is being found in the right before God. And so the virtue of justice is bound closely with the doctrine of justification. We are declared innocent. We have been found right or just by God. And so this act of justification through Christ's atonement reflects both God's justice, that sin is being punished, and his loving mercy, that our sins are forgiven. So the sin is punished through Christ's atonement, but our sins are forgiven. So we are the recipient of God's mercy, even though God's justice is being carried out. Knowing we are justified before God, we are now freed from the judgment of others. Does that make sense? So now it doesn't matter how the rest of the world finds us. It doesn't matter what any other human thinks about my behavior, about whether or not I am just or unjust. Because the Lord has made me just in his eyes, right? And so my eternal welfare, my status before God is determined by God's verdict, no one else's.